This is the sixth lecture in a 10-part series based on dark patterns, deceptive design, and the law. Chapter 5 moves the analysis away from the familiar territory of misleading buttons and consent banners. Its claim is that the most consequential forms of manipulation increasingly sit beneath the interface, in the system architecture that determines what the user sees, when they see it, and how the system responds. The lecture explains that architectural shift, the role of personalization and feedback loops, and the regulatory problem it creates. Chapter 5 changes the level analysis from what we talked about in the earlier chapters, which explain visible dark patterns, their harms, and the legal regimes that try to control them. This chapter asks what happens when manipulation migrates beneath the interface. Its central claim is that system architecture increasingly determines what the user sees, when the user sees it, and how the system should respond. The lecture therefore examines three matters: the movement from interface deception to architectural control, the role of personalization and feedback loops, and the regulatory problem created when the relevant design choices become difficult to observe or reproduce. Legal analysis often begins with the visible screen. That approach works reasonably well for a misleading button, a pre-selected box, or a cancellation flow that adds unnecessary steps. Chapter 5 argues that the approach becomes inadequate once the interface merely expresses decisions taken elsewhere. The architecture generates the available options, ranks and filters them, determines the default, and decides when friction should appear or disappear. It can therefore precondition decision-making before the user becomes aware that a choice architecture exists. The concern is not only that the interface distorts a decision, the architecture can prefigure the outcome by structuring the decision space in the platform's commercial interest. The chapter uses system architecture in a precise technical sense. It includes databases, servers, application logic, communication protocols, algorithms, and the processes that connect them all together. Those components govern data flows and produce behavioral outcomes. The interface remains important, but it operates as a manifestation layer. Architecture determines which options appear, how they are ordered, what price is displayed, when a prompt appears, and what consent looks like in practice. Figure 5.4 captures the layered relationship between the user interface and triggered, deterministic, and non-deterministic processes below it. The legal object is therefore not only the button, it is the process that engineered the button and selected the circumstances in which it appeared. The chapter distinguishes three architectures. Triggered user interface systems follow predetermined branches. A regulator can usually reproduce the journey, map the logic, and identify the point at which the system steers the user. Complex deterministic systems remain stable in a different sense. Identical inputs should generate identical outputs, but the calculations may be difficult to reconstruct. Recommendation engines, ranking systems, and personalized pricing can operate in this category. Finally, non-deterministic systems use probabilistic models and may adapt as data, model states, or system conditions change. Similar users, or even the same user at different times, may receive different outcomes. As complexity increases, transparency and predictability fall, while the capacity for subtle and individualized influence rises. These categories also form an evidential ladder. A screenshot can expose confirm shaming or hidden cancellation control. A multi-step pattern requires the investigator to reproduce the journey and the relevant account state. A complex algorithm may require access to ranking rules, source code, system logs, and records of A/B testing. An adaptive AI system may require model access, experimental records, and comparisons across users or cohorts. The interface becomes progressively less probative as manipulation migrates into the architecture. At the far end of the spectrum, the architecture becomes the evidence. Regulation that relies on screenshots and ordinary user testing will therefore identify the visible symptoms while missing the mechanisms that produced it. Personalization changes the relationship from a one-off nudge into a feedback system. The platform observes behavior, infers preferences or vulnerabilities, tailors the interface or offer, records the response, and updates the profile. The user's action is both the outcome of one intervention and the input for the next. Figure 5.7 extends Norman's action model by adding the system's own cycle of receiving, processing, deciding, and responding to data. The additional cycle separates a static pattern from systemic manipulation. The tactic can evolve as the platform learns which intervention produces engagement, conversion, continued use, or spending. The architecture does not simply present a choice. It experiments on the conditions under which that choice will become more likely. The chapter applies the architecture argument to three sectors. Social media platforms optimize engagement metrics. Recommender systems learn from explicit and surveillance data, amplify related material, and can escalate content because material that provokes a response receives further distribution. Gaming systems combine dynamic difficulty, variable reward, scarcity, and microtransaction prompts. The system can lower difficulty to prevent disengagement, increase frustration at a monetizable moment, or offer a paid shortcut. E-commerce systems personalize ranking, pricing, scarcity messages, and re-engagement. A user may receive a different order of products, a different prompt, or a different price because the system has inferred willingness to pay or susceptibility to urgency. The products differ, but the architecture is recurrent: a commercial objective, continuous behavioral data, an adaptive intervention, and a feedback loop that strengthens platform control over the choice environment. At the most sophisticated end, the chapter introduces the Leiser Torment Nexus. The phrase describes an AI-driven system assigned a high-level strategic objective, such as maximizing engagement, which then learns and adapts its methods. The manipulative tactic need not to be fixed in advance. The system can infer susceptibility, test interventions, and refine the approach for each user. That creates three regulatory difficulties at once. First, individualization. Different users receive different tactics. Secondly, adaptation. The tactic changes as the system learns. Thirdly, unstable evidence. A regulator may not reproduce the same outcome through a single test account. The problem is therefore more than opacity. It concerns a system that can discover and personalize the means of influence. The regulatory critique follows from that architecture. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, focus principally on interface design and defined categories of platform. The GDPR focuses on personal data processing. Consumer law focuses on commercial practices and transactional distortion. Each instrument can address part of the problem, but none necessarily captures the system as a whole. The chapter also questions transparency as the dominant remedy. Disclosure assumes that users can understand and contest a complex architecture. Systemic manipulation is anticipatory, distributed, and cumulative. It may not correspond to a single interface event, a single processing operation, or a single measurable loss. Regulation, therefore, needs accountability for the objective, the data signals, the adaptive logic, and the resulting pattern of harm, rather than accountability only for the visible symptom. The conclusion requires one qualification. Personalization is not inherently manipulative. It can improve relevance, accessibility, and usability. The legal question concerns the relationship between the platform's objective, the signal it uses, the way it adapts, and the effects it produces. 4 audit questions follow. What is the system optimizing? Which signals identify preference or vulnerability? How does the system test and personalize interventions? What effects accumulate for autonomy, welfare, and market fairness? Those questions move scrutiny from the visible interface to the architecture that structures the decision environment. The next lecture turns to Chapter 6 and asks whether the AI Act's prohibition on manipulative AI practices can reach the forms of influence that Chapter 5 had identified.